Anna Whitmore pressed her torn wedding veil against her chest as she pushed open the door of Jenkins's bakery, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread she could not afford, her steps slow and unsteady, as if every stride might break her. The townsfolk outside had followed her with curious stares, their whispers hissing like dry grass catching fire. And when she reached the counter and raised the fragile lace in her hands, her voice cracked with desperation. "Please, just one loaf. It is all I have left." But Clara Jenkins narrowed her eyes and folded her arms, declaring coldly that bread was coin only, and no scraps of cloth could pay the debt of hunger. And the silence that followed carried with it the weight of shame so heavy that Anna's arms quivered and her heart begged her to run. Yet her empty stomach anchored her feet to the floor. One man in the corner scoffed, muttering that women should know their place, and another whispered that a veil meant nothing once its vows were gone. And still Anna held it out, her fingers trembling as though letting go of it would mean letting go of her last claim to dignity, until a boy's voice, young but steady, broke through the murmur like a knife-cutting rope. "Keep it," he said, and every head turned to see Daniel Hart, just 14, son of rancher Samuel Hart, standing tall despite his slight frame, his dusty boots planted firm as his eyes met Anna's with something the crowd had forgotten: mercy. "We don't need your veil," he continued, his tone stronger now. "We need you." And the bakery filled with a hush so complete that Clara Jenkins herself faltered, her lips parting but no words coming, for the boy had spoken with the courage of a man twice his years, and Anna felt her knees weaken, not from hunger this time, but from the suddenness of kindness. And as the veil slipped from her hands, Daniel caught it, pressing it back against her chest with a reverence that stunned the room, his father watching from behind with a face carved of stone, proud perhaps, or cautious. No one could tell. I am Elias Redfeather, and this is a story from the year 1874 in the New Mexico Territory, a story carried in whispers through the saloons and the schoolhouses, told around campfires when the prairie winds blew low, for it was the day a boy's words turned shame into dignity and changed the memory of Dust Haven forever. And I tell it now because mercy, once given, becomes a seed that grows even in the driest soil. Samuel Hart finally broke the silence with a curt nod, rough voice carrying over the crowd. "Then she eats with us." And though his tone was measured, the decision rang louder than any whip, louder than the scoff of Clara Jenkins, louder than the whispers of men who thought bread was more valuable than compassion. And Anna's tears spilled freely as she clutched the veil, for in that moment she realized that hunger had not stolen everything. Her worth still shone in the eyes of a boy who believed she mattered, and that belief would carry her farther than any loaf of bread. The town of Dust Haven buzzed like a stirred beehive after Daniel Hart's words, men shifting their boots uneasily, and women pulling their shawls tighter as though they had just witnessed something that ought to have been impossible, for it was not common for a rancher's son to challenge the unwritten rules of pride and trade. Yet Daniel had done it with nothing more than the clear strength in his voice. And now every eye turned to his father, Samuel Hart, who stood weather-beaten and stern, his face unreadable, his jaw locked as if he wrestled between two worlds, the world of survival where every loaf counted, and the world his son had just opened where dignity was worth more than coin, and Anna Whitmore felt her cheeks burn as the silence stretched, her veil clutched desperately against her chest, her heart pounding as though she had sinned simply by daring to hope. Clara Jenkins broke the tension first, her tongue sharp. "You'll ruin her with pity, Samuel, and you'll ruin yourselves too. No ranch can feed every beggar with a story." But her voice lacked the certainty it usually carried, for the people were no longer murmuring against Anna. They were murmuring against Clara, and one old ranch hand muttered, "Let the boy be. He's got more sense than this town's had in years." While another woman whispered that maybe it was mercy, not coin, that kept a place alive. Samuel Hart finally stepped forward, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor, his voice carrying with a gravelly strength that silenced every doubt. "She comes with us, she keeps her veil, and she eats at our table." And the shock that rippled through the crowd was almost visible, like a wave breaking, because it was one thing for a boy to speak of mercy, but it was another for a man hardened by land and work to declare it so. And Anna's vision blurred with tears she had tried to hold back since her husband's death, the kind that carried both shame and relief at once. Daniel reached for her arm, steadying her as though he had always been her kin, and the crowd parted reluctantly to let them pass, some bowing their heads in quiet respect, others sneering with the bitterness of those who resented mercy they could not find for themselves. And as they stepped into the hot afternoon sun, the veil fluttered lightly in the wind, no longer a token of desperation, but a sign that her story had not ended where she feared it would. I, Elias Redfeather, who tell you this tale, remember the hush that fell upon Dusthaven that day, for the people did not cheer, they did not jeer, they only watched. And in their watching they bore witness to the beginning of a new story, though none of them yet knew how costly or how redemptive it would become. Anna Whitmore rode in silence on the wagon bench beside Samuel Hart, the dust of the trail swirling behind them while Daniel sat upright at her other side, as though proud to be her guard. And though her stomach ached with hunger, what gnawed her more was the question of why this man and his boy had lifted her from the jaws of humiliation, when so many others had only watched. The Hart Ranch stretched wide across the valley, fences rough but strong, cattle scattered against the horizon, and the house, though worn by years of wind, stood like a sentinel of survival. And when they entered the yard, Samuel called out gruffly, "Clara, set another place," to his late wife's sister who kept house for them, and though she frowned, she obeyed, for Samuel's voice was not one to be contested. Daniel hopped down quickly, offering his hand to Anna as though she were a lady and not a starving widow clutching a veil, and she allowed herself to take it, the gesture sparking a warmth she had not felt since her husband had lived, a warmth not of romance but of belonging, however fragile. Inside, the table was simple. Bread, beans, a bit of meat, nothing extravagant. But when Samuel gestured for her to sit, Anna nearly wept, for she had been prepared to eat standing, to snatch scraps like a beggar, not to sit among them as equal. And when Daniel passed her the bread first, she whispered thank you so softly it was nearly lost under the creak of the house. Samuel studied her across the table with eyes that saw both a burden and a question, and though he said nothing, his silence was permission enough. Anna ate slowly, each bite a miracle, her hands shaking as she tried to hide her tears, and when the meal ended, Clara muttered that an extra mouth meant more work, but Daniel shot her a look so fierce it silenced even her bitterness. I, Elias Redfeather, who retell this memory, remind you that the first step toward a home is not the walls or the roof, but the seat given at the table. And that night, Anna Whitmore, carrying a veil instead of coin, found her place not in charity, but in dignity, though she did not yet know the tests still waiting at the edges of her fragile mercy. The dawn came cold across the Hart Ranch, the kind of chill that slid through torn sleeves and reminded a widow of how quickly warmth could vanish. And Anna rose before the rooster crowed, still clutching the veil she kept folded by her bedside, as though it were both a relic and a shield, her body aching, but her mind resolved that if she was to stay under this roof, she would not be a burden. Samuel Hart had said nothing of her role, but his silence weighed heavy, his glances sharpened by years of toil. And Clara, his late wife's sister, made her displeasure plain by banging pots louder than needful, muttering about mouths to feed and strangers underfoot. Yet Daniel's eyes carried none of that judgment, only a quiet eagerness as he watched Anna rise from the chair and follow him out into the yard. He handed her a bucket, testing perhaps, and though the handle cut into her blistered palm, she gritted her teeth and carried it to the well, her breath catching in the morning air. And when Samuel stepped outside, arms folded across his chest, he said nothing but pointed toward the corral where fence rails sagged, and Anna nodded, lifting wood beside Daniel until her shoulders burned, determined not to falter even when her dress tore along the hem. By noon, her hands bled from rope and splinters, but she still set bread and beans on the table, serving the family as though it were her rightful place. And though Clara sneered that she was playing the part of wife without the name, Anna only bowed her head, her silence more powerful than argument. Samuel studied her with eyes narrowed, a man who measured worth not by words but by endurance, and though he said nothing, his boots shifted as though he recognized something rising in her, a strength he had not expected. I am Elias Redfeather, and I have seen many who came to the frontier believing survival was won by rifles and coin. But I tell you now that Dusthaven remembered Anna Whitmore because she proved survival could also be won by will. And as the sun sank that evening, the ranch held its breath, knowing that the real test of her place had only just begun. The summer wind that day carried the smell of dry grass and the kind of tension that ranchers feared, for in the New Mexico territory of 1874, even a spark could mean ruin. And Anna Whitmore, though still new to the Hart Ranch, felt the unease in the way Samuel paced the yard, and Daniel checked the lanterns twice before carrying them back to the barn. She had tried all morning to keep herself busy, mending Daniel's shirt and sweeping the porch, but her eyes never strayed far from the folded veil resting near her bed. For though it had been mocked in town as worthless, to her it was the last thread tying her to the man she had once called husband. And even more than that, it had become a fragile symbol of the mercy Daniel had given her when he told her to keep it. That afternoon, as Samuel and Daniel worked the cattle, Anna heard Clara shouting from the kitchen that smoke was rising by the barn, and before she could process the words, Daniel was already sprinting, his small frame cutting across the yard like a dart, Samuel close behind, barking orders to bring water. Anna froze only a moment before the smell of burning hay reached her nose and terror shot through her chest, for she remembered where she had left the veil, folded on a shelf near the lantern Daniel had returned earlier, and without thinking of consequence she ran after them, her dress catching on a rail, her breath tearing through her throat as she reached the barn doors and saw flames curling up the dry boards like fingers of the devil himself. Samuel bellowed for her to stay back, his voice fierce with command, but Anna ignored him, shoving into the smoke that stung her eyes. Coughing violently as she clawed through the haze, and though her body screamed for her to turn away, her heart refused, because to lose the veil would mean to lose not just cloth, but memory, promise, and the fragile thread of dignity she had barely begun to recover. Daniel, seeing her stumble inside, shouted her name and without hesitation plunged in after her, wrapping his small arm around her and dragging her back even as he coughed, and his own eyes streamed. And though Samuel roared in anger at their recklessness, he still threw buckets of water with the strength of a man who had lost too much to let fire take more. Anna gasped as she clutched at the shelf, her fingers brushing the veil just as flame licked the edge of the wood, and she yanked it free, the lace singed at the hem but still whole. And Daniel pulled her back into the sunlight where the townsfolk who had gathered gasped to see her emerge from the smoke, veil clutched like treasure, her hair singed, her face streaked with soot. Samuel looked at her, his fury tempered by the sight of the boy holding her steady. And though his mouth pressed into a hard line, something in his eyes flickered. A recognition that this woman was no longer merely a burden, but a soul willing to fight for memory the way others fought for land. I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you that Dusthaven carried the story of that fire long after the barn was rebuilt, for it was not the flames that burned deepest, but the sight of a widow clutching her veil from the smoke, while a boy no older than 14 stood beside her, and that memory became the kind of tale a town cannot shake. Whispered in awe because it was proof that courage does not belong only to men with rifles, but also to women who refuse to let mercy be lost to ashes. When the smoke had cleared and the barn was saved by the desperate dousing of buckets and the prayers of every ranch hand who feared losing their livelihood, Samuel Hart stood with arms folded like a granite cliff at the edge of the yard, his eyes fixed not on the blackened boards but on his son. And Anna knew the storm was about to break. For though Samuel had not raised his voice when the crowd gathered, nor when the fire licked so close to the hayloft, he was a man who carried his words like bullets, few but deadly when released. Daniel still clutched Anna's arm protectively, the soot smeared on his face making him look both younger and older at once. But Samuel's gaze did not soften, and when at last he spoke, his voice rolled like distant thunder. "You risked your life for cloth, boy, and nearly lost it for nothing?" And Daniel lifted his chin, his voice cracking but firm as he answered, "It wasn't nothing, Pa. It was hers, and if it mattered to her, then it mattered to me." Which silenced even Clara, who had been ready to scold Anna for foolishness. Samuel's jaw worked as though grinding stone, and his silence weighed heavier than any anger, until at last he turned his eyes on Anna, his words sharp as spurs. "And you run into fire for lace like it's gold. Mercy we gave you, food we gave you, and you repay it with recklessness?" Anna's breath trembled, but she steadied herself, clutching the veil tighter, her voice low yet unbroken. "It is not lace alone. It is the last of my vows, the last of a life lost, and I will not see it burned while I still breathe." And her words carried a gravity that startled even her, for she had spoken not in shame, but in defiance of despair. Samuel looked from the widow to his son and back again, his face unreadable, before he spat into the dust and muttered, "A ranch survives by sense, not sentiment," then turned his back, striding toward the corral, his shoulders rigid with conflict he would not confess. Daniel whispered to Anna that she had done right, that he would have done the same, and she smiled faintly, though her hands shook, for she could not tell if Samuel's coldness meant she was one step closer to being turned out or one step closer to being tested. "I am Elias Redfeather, and I have walked through towns where mercy was given and towns where mercy was scorned, and I tell you this, men like Samuel Hart do not speak their hearts plainly, but when they begin to wrestle with themselves, the world shifts around them, and in Dusthaven of 1874, this was the moment when a father's warning became more than discipline. It became the first crack in a wall that would not stand forever. The morning after the fire, Anna Whitmore rose before the first streak of sunlight broke across the mesa, her hands still raw from splinters and rope burns, her body aching from smoke. Yet her resolve hardened like iron in the forge, for she knew Samuel Hart's warning had not been idle words but a test, and she was determined not to be found wanting. She gathered her torn dress and tied her hair back with a strip from the edge of her veil, not to protect it this time, but to remind herself that the cloth was no longer just a remnant of vows past, but a banner under which she would fight for her place. And she stepped into the yard where the cattle lowed restlessly, the corral gate half broken from years of strain. Daniel was already there, eyes bright with boyish pride as he watched her take up a pitchfork and begin clearing hay. Sweat dampening her brow, her back bent but unyielding, and when Clara Jenkins came to the door, her mouth twisted to hurl some sharp remark, she found herself silenced by the sheer determination written in Anna's posture, for it is hard to mock someone who refuses to collapse under weight. Samuel appeared mid-morning, his shadow long against the fence, watching in silence as Anna hauled water, tended calves, and even helped mend the sagging rail with a hammer that bruised her palms. And though he said nothing, his eyes narrowed not in scorn, but in a kind of study, as though measuring how long a widow could last in a man's world. When noon came, Anna prepared beans and cornbread with what little they had, and she placed the food on the table not as a servant, but as someone claiming her rightful seat. And Samuel, though he did not speak, allowed it, eating without protest while Daniel beamed openly, proud of the woman who had already proven more courage than most men in Dust Haven. Later that evening, when a storm rolled in sudden from the west, lightning cracking over the hills, the cattle spooked and broke through the weakened rail, and Anna, without hesitation, grabbed a lantern and ran with Daniel into the rain, her skirts heavy with mud, her hair plastered against her face, and together they drove the frightened herd back toward safety, her voice strong above the thunder as she called commands Daniel had only ever heard his father shout. And when Samuel arrived on horseback, prepared to scold, he saw instead a woman soaked to the bone, holding the lantern high while the boy guided the last calf through the gate. And something in his face shifted though his lips held firm, for he could not deny that Anna Whitmore had earned her place in sweat and storm. I am Elias Redfeather, and I remind you that the frontier did not bend for weakness. And yet, in that summer of 1874, it bent for a widow who would not bow to despair, and Dust Haven remembered her not as a beggar of bread, but as a woman who claimed her worth with calloused hands, and a voice that would not be silenced. And though Samuel Hart did not yet confess it, a seed had been planted in him too, and seeds in dry ground, once watered by storm, grow roots deeper than anyone expects. By the time the week had passed, the story of the widow who had carried her veil from smoke and storm was already weaving through the streets of Dust Haven, and though some spoke with awe, more spoke with suspicion, for towns are quick to turn mercy into gossip. And when Samuel Hart rode into town with Daniel and Anna trailing quietly behind on foot, eyes followed them like hawks circling a wounded calf. Clara Jenkins, never one to hold her tongue, told the other women near the well that Samuel had lost his sense letting a beggar sit at his table, and that the boy would be ruined by the softness of a stranger's tears. And though they nodded in agreement, their glances betrayed curiosity more than contempt, because it is not every day a widow walks out of a barn fire with lace still clutched in her hand. At the general store, two ranchers leaned on barrels and whispered that if Samuel had food to spare for charity, perhaps he was hiding more cattle than he admitted at market, and a third laughed that it was not cattle he was feeding but pride, for no man wanted to admit his son had shamed a whole town by defending a woman with nothing but lace. Anna kept her head lowered, her cheeks hot, her heart sinking with every passing word, but Daniel walked at her side with his chin high, glaring back at anyone who dared laugh, and when a shopkeeper's boy sneered and spat at her feet, Daniel shoved him back hard enough that his father had to pull him away, and Samuel's face darkened not with shame of Anna, but with the anger of a man realizing that charity was now being counted against his house. He said nothing, only finished his business with quiet fury, but as they loaded supplies onto the wagon, Anna could hear the whispers trailing after them, whispers that would not fade, whispers that threatened to make her presence a burden too heavy for even Daniel's mercy to carry. That night back at the ranch, she sat on the porch, veil folded in her lap, and wondered if she had brought more harm than good to those who had shown her kindness. her tears falling silent until Daniel sat beside her and said simply, "They don't matter. You belong here." And his words steadied her, even as thunder rolled in the distance like a warning. I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you I have seen frontier towns build walls with words sharper than stone. And Dusthaven in 1874 was no different, for they would have sooner broken a widow with whispers than lifted her with kindness. Yet it is in those whispers that a story grows teeth, and Anna Whitmore's tale was not finished. It had only begun to gnaw at the pride of a community that feared the strength of a woman who refused to bow. It was on a Saturday afternoon when the full weight of Dusthaven's scorn pressed itself upon Anna Whitmore, for she had walked with Daniel into town to fetch nails and feed, while Samuel bartered for seed. And though she kept her veil folded carefully within her dress, the townsfolk remembered too well the sight of her holding it up for bread. And memory is crueler than hunger. As she passed the blacksmith's stall, a group of men leaned against a post, one of them sneering, "Careful, she might try to trade her veil for a horseshoe next." And another chuckled that Samuel Hart must be so desperate for a wife that he would take lace as dowry, their laughter ringing louder than the hammer on the anvil. And Anna's cheeks flamed, her throat tightening until she could barely breathe. Daniel stepped forward, small fists clenched, ready to lash out, but Anna caught his arm and shook her head, not because she agreed with the mockery, but because she would not see him wounded for her sake. Still, the crowd swelled with whispers, and soon Clara Jenkins's voice carried sharp as ever. "You all see it, don't you? Samuel Hart's boy bringing home strays, feeding them like they're worth his table, and what's next? Will he open his land to every widow with a rag of lace?" And the women at her side laughed, their shawls drawn close as though piety excused their cruelty. Samuel emerged then, carrying his goods, his eyes flashing as he heard the words, and though he said nothing, the silence that fell when his shadow stretched across the square was heavier than a shouted curse. For Samuel Hart was not a man mocked lightly. Yet even his presence did not erase the sting of those whispers. Anna lowered her gaze, clutching Daniel's hand, praying for the ground to open beneath her feet. But Daniel raised his voice with a courage that startled even his father. "She's not a beggar, she's family, and someday you'll wish you had half her strength." And though the men laughed harder, Samuel laid a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip both firm and proud. And with that single gesture he told the town that mockery would not shake what mercy had already claimed. "I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you that the cruelest whip isn't made of leather, but of words. Yet words can cut both ways." And on that day, in Dusthaven of 1874, the boy's words, though scorned, carried more truth than the laughter of grown men. A truth that would carve its way into the marrow of this story before its end. The breaking point came sooner than anyone expected, for when Anna Whitmore returned to Dusthaven a week later with Samuel and Daniel to deliver hides, the townsfolk gathered in the square as if waiting for her to falter, their eyes sharp and their laughter coiled like rattlesnakes ready to strike. And Clara Jenkins, never content with whispers, called out for all to hear, "There she is, the bride without a groom, the beggar who thinks lace makes her worthy." And the crowd chuckled, some muttering cruel remarks, others shaking their heads as if pity were weakness. Anna froze, her heart hammering, her fingers clutching the edge of her dress where the veil was hidden, and for a moment she felt herself shrinking again into the girl who had once been too timid to raise her voice. But then Daniel looked up at her with eyes wide and pleading, his hand gripping hers as though he was begging her not to let them win. And Samuel stood behind them silent, his jaw tight, but his silence carrying the weight of choice. Would he speak for her, or would she speak for herself? Anna's breath came ragged, but something deep inside her surged like a river breaking through rock, and she stepped forward, pulling the veil from her dress and holding it high so every eye could see, the singed edges proof of smoke and fire, the frayed threads proof of storm, her voice steady though her body trembled. You laugh because you think this is cloth, but this is memory, this is vow, this is all I had when mercy found me, and I will not trade it for bread or coin, for it has already bought me something greater, dignity. And the square fell into stunned silence, the laughter choking on itself as her words carried with a strength no one had expected from a woman they thought broken. Daniel's chest swelled with pride, Samuel's eyes narrowed not in scorn, but in reluctant respect. And Clara, for once, had no reply, her lips pressed tight as the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads, others staring in awe. I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you that Dusthaven remembered that day not for its laughter, but for the silence that followed, the kind of silence that clings to memory. For in the summer of 1874, a widow lifted her veil before a town that tried to shame her, and spoke with the voice of a woman who had learned that mercy, once given, can grow into courage, and courage, once spoken, cannot be silenced. The silence that followed Anna's words in the square did not fade when the Hart family returned to the ranch. For though the town's whispers carried on like wind through canyon walls, inside Samuel Hart's house, a new weight pressed heavier than any gossip, the weight of a man deciding whether pride or truth would shape his legacy. He rose early the next morning and watched from the porch as Anna carried water to the trough, her shoulders squared despite exhaustion, her veil tied at her waist like a banner of stubbornness, and Daniel followed close behind, speaking to her with a joy that only a boy who had found his champion could feel. And though Samuel had long believed survival was won by sweat alone, he could not deny that something in his household had shifted. For work was lighter, meals warmer, and even silence seemed less bitter since Anna had sat at their table. When noon came, he called her to the barn where the cattle lowed, his voice rough as ever. A ranch needs more than words. It needs hands, and you've proven yours won't break. And though his face betrayed no smile, his words were a recognition sharper than praise. For Samuel Hart was not a man to waste breath on lies, and Anna, her hands still blistered, bowed her head, but lifted her eyes with quiet pride, whispering only, "Thank you, Mr. Hart," her voice carrying more power than tears. Daniel, overhearing, beamed so brightly it seemed the boy might burst, and he cried, "She belongs with us, Pa, you know it." And Samuel laid a heavy hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze resting on the widow, his silence long enough to stretch into eternity before he finally said, "Then let it be known, this ranch will not call her beggar, nor burden, but kin." And his words, gruff as they were, rang like iron struck true, sealing what the town had tried to break. Anna's breath shuddered as tears filled her eyes, not the tears of shame, but of release, for to be named kin by a man as hard as Samuel was a gift worth more than coin or cattle. And though Clara muttered curses in the kitchen, the sound was drowned by Daniel's laughter as he seized Anna's hand and shouted that Dusthaven itself could not take her away now. I am Elias Redfeather, and I remind you that in the summer of 1874, when Samuel Hart gave his word, it bound more tightly than law, for the frontier measured a man not by papers but by promises. And from that day the widow with the veil was no longer a stranger on his porch, but a name woven into the Hart family itself, a truth that no whisper could undo. The day the veil returned to its rightful place wasn't marked by trumpets or the mayor's pen, but by the quiet strength of a ranch yard filled with the scent of hay and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. For Samuel Hart, after weeks of silence and watching, finally spoke the words that turned rumor into truth when he called Anna Whitmore to the porch and told her in his gravel-thick voice that no longer would she be seen as guest or burden, but as family, whose place was as sure as the timbers holding his roof. And Daniel, his eyes alight, rushed to the trunk in the small bedroom where Anna had kept her singed veil folded like fragile treasure, and pressed it into her hands, begging her to wear it once more. Not as trade or proof of hunger, but as the sign of the dignity she had reclaimed. Trembling, she draped the veil over her hair. Its edges still blackened from smoke, yet to Daniel's eyes, and even to Samuel's hardened gaze, it shone brighter than gold. And as the afternoon sun caught the lace, the ranch hands paused in their work, hats pulled low out of respect, for they understood without needing words that something sacred was taking place. Samuel cleared his throat. The man who had once called sense more valuable than sentiment, now declaring in front of boy, woman, and sky, "This house claims you, this land claims you, and I claim you as kin." And Anna wept openly, not with the sorrow of shame, but with the release of years of carrying weight alone, her tears wetting the cloth until it shimmered with life once more. Daniel, unable to contain himself, proclaimed with all the pride of youth, "Then Dusthaven can say what it will. Our ranch has found its mother." And though Samuel did not soften enough to smile, the way his hand rested on Anna's shoulder was more than enough, a gesture that sealed what the town's mockery could not break. "I am Elias Redfeather, and I tell you that in the year 1874, in the dust-swept valleys of New Mexico Territory, a widow who once held out her veil for bread found instead a family who returned it to her as honor, and I close this story with the memory of her standing in the yard, the veil drifting in the evening wind. No longer a relic of loss, but a banner of belonging. For such is the way of mercy when it takes root. It grows into a tomorrow that even dust and fire cannot erase. And so it was, and so it will remain, long after our voices are gone." If you had seen her in that bakery, veil trembling in her hands, would you have spoken up like Daniel did? Tell me in the comments.